Hello again. Several people have asked me in the comments here to say something about the attack on a ship of the American Navy in 1967. The USS Liberty was collecting SIGINT, which is intelligence from radio messages and so on, during the Six-Day War which Israel fought with Egypt, Syria and Jordan that June. That's to say the June of 1967. It was severely damaged and a number of sailors were killed. This is the USS Liberty. Israel is a very small country, and for the first 30 years of its existence it was surrounded by three countries which were sworn to destroy it. So the situation in 1967, that's 53 years ago, was as follows. In the north, the Syrians occupied a plateau called the Golan Heights, which is high above the Galilee, and they used that to lob shells and mortar bombs and sniper fire at the farmers north of the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, as some people call it. Jordan, of course, had illegally seized an area of land known as Judea and Samaria, and also half of Jerusalem, and they were allowing guerrillas to use that area as a base to attack Israel. Egypt, of course, had the southern tip of the Sinai as an armed base, and from there they could use that as a choke point to prevent shipping getting through to Israel's port of Eilat and the Red Sea. So it was quite a tricky situation for Israel at that time. The war began in June 1967 when Egypt imposed a blockade on Israel's Red Sea port. Blockades of other nations' ports are actually an act of war in themselves. You don't have to do anything more. If you used armed force to prevent people shipping from getting in and out of their ports, that's de facto an act of war. Once Egypt started blockading Eilat, Israel responded by destroying the Egyptian Air Force on the ground and then sending troops into the Sinai to raise the blockade. They actually wanted to widen the war though, because they had other aims. They wanted to drive the Jordanians back across the Jordan, obviously, and free the land there. Also, they wanted to gain the Golan Heights to protect the settlements in the Galilee. There was a bit of a problem though. The USS Liberty, although technically in international waters and definitely a ship belonging to an Israeli ally, was eavesdropping on radio communications of the Israeli army. And once they'd got that information, they were relaying it to ships of the American Sixth Fleet, which were cruising in the Mediterranean. They're based at Naples, yeah. And of course the Soviets in turn were eavesdropping on the Americans and picking up all the information about Israel, and then they were relaying it to Egypt, thus giving Israel's enemies the drop on it, as it were. Egypt, of course, was a client state of the islands, the Soviets at that time. After the Israelis had Egypt on the run, they wanted to launch a surprise attack on the Golan Heights, but they didn't want the Syrians to be warned. They wanted it to be a surprise, and they felt that the best way of doing that was to prevent anybody from listening in and finding out what they were up to. They didn't want their enemies tipped off. The obvious way to maintain secrecy was, of course, to take out the USS Liberty and make sure they were no longer able to listen to Israeli signal intelligence. The decision was then taken at the very highest level to launch an attack on a ship of the American Navy in international waters, which was rather a tricky undertaking. On June 8th, 1967, two waves of Israeli aircraft attacked the USS Liberty. They strafed it with cannon fire, fired shells at it, and even dropped napalm onto the ship. And they followed this up by attacks by 3 motor torpedo boats. The USS Liberty was torpedoed as well. By the time the Israelis had finished, 34 of the crew were dead, and it was fairly certain that the USS Liberty wouldn't be collecting any SIGINT in the near future. The following day, of course, Israel attacked the Syrian positions on the Golan Heights and captured them, the Syrians being taken completely by surprise, which would not have been the case if the USS Liberty had been intact. Everything worked out for the best in the end, though, because the Americans pretended to believe it was all a terrible mistake, and Israel paid millions of dollars in compensation. They got the money from America anyway. The Americans actually gave them the money and then received it back with great fanfare. So it looked as though Israel was paying compensation. It was a little bit of like the 3-card trick. Anyway, everybody was happy after that. One of the things which I think some people fail to realise is that Israel will do anything at all which it feels is necessary for its survival. And I mean quite literally anything. In the 1970s, they only had a few nuclear weapons, and these weren't on missiles, heavy things that had to be dropped by aircraft. They came up with a plan called the Samson option, which was if Israel was attacked by anybody and it looked as though it was going to be overrun, then some aircraft would take off on a one-way mission to drop nuclear bombs on Russia, on cities like Tashkent and so on. That would almost certainly start a nuclear war between Russia and America. I honestly don't think everybody quite appreciates just how far Israel will go in defence of their country. Believe me, taking out an American spy ship was nothing at all to them.